Now I really realized I didn't get the clicker. Is it down here somewhere? I might get started. I forgot to get it. If somebody can bring it down. So this is the second in our series on A Christmas Carol. And as you just heard, the one we'll be focusing on today is We Three Kings of Orient Are. Now I'll confess, I'm not going to talk about the carol. I'm just using it as a pretext to actually look at the story of the Magi, because they're pretty enigmatic. Thank you very much. And when I say the Magi, an image like this probably comes to mind from years and years of Christmas cards. But although it looks familiar, almost nothing about this picture is true. Nowhere in the Bible does it tell us that there were three of them. They weren't kings. The star never led them to the manger. They never met the shepherds. And there almost certainly was never any snow. So who are they really? Why are they part of the story? And I'm hoping that in the next half hour, we're going to unpack this story and find out what role they actually play. And to do that, it would be good to read Matthew's story. They only show up in Matthew's gospel. Only one of the four gospels has this story. And so Sam and Susie have been kind enough to do it for us as a bit of a dramatic reading. And little birdie told me it's your anniversary today. So please join me in congratulating them. Maybe it's the other way around. 1, 2. Maybe the other way.
1, 2.
Hello?
No.
Let's see, we do this a lot, right?
Right.
Stand here. Do you want to stand up on the stage? Stand up where people can see you. Move over.
He's bossy. Okay. So we're reading Matthew 2 from the NIV. And here we go. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked,
"Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him."
When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born.
"In Bethlehem in Judea, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel."
Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said,
"Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so I too may go and worship him."
After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream.
"Get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him."
So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet.
"Out of Egypt I called my son."
When Herod realised that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled.
A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more.
After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said,
Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead.
So he got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susie. All right. So now that we have the facts in mind, we're going to spend the next half hour kind of unpacking this story. And what I want to do is use a framework that a friend of mine developed. His name is Rod Thompson, and he taught for many years in a theological college. And he came up with this scheme called TG21. T stands for the text, so you have to get into the story and understand the history and the context and the genre to the point where you can almost smell the characters. And then the G is for gospel. Because Jesus changes everything, we then have to think, how do we understand this story in the light of the gospel, the life and the work of Jesus? And only having done those two things can we then go to the 21, which is what's the application in the 21st century. So he calls this TG21. Ready to get into it? All right. So let's start with the Magi. So translated wise men, but the Greek word is Magi, and it's usually translated as magician. Magi is plural, magus is singular, but the Greek word itself actually comes from a Persian word, which refers to Zoroastrian priests. Now, for those of you who don't know, Zoroastrianism is a very old religion, started around 1500 BC in the area of Persia, then Babylon, what is now Iraq and Iran. And these priests studied the world. And because this was long before the Western Enlightenment, there was no division between the natural world and the supernatural world. And so these guys were like a combination of an astronomer and an astrologer, or a chemist and an alchemist. And so they really bridged the divide. They were like priests and scientists rolled into one. They just studied the world as a whole, natural and supernatural. And so because of their education and their wisdom and their knowledge, they became advisors to kings. And so from the time that this religion started in Babylonia and then Persia, they worked as advisors to various kings. And so the thought is that at the time of Jesus' birth, these wise men, these magi, were serving the Parthian Empire. They were serving the Parthian king. As I said, that's where Iraq and Iran is now. And so this image actually is one of the earliest pictures we have of the Magi. It comes from a 6th century chapel in Italy. And the interesting thing is that the Magi are wearing these funny little hats, which turn out to be Parthian caps, very typical of this empire. And so it kind of fills out this idea that they were sent, they were in the employ of the king of Parthia. So now we know a little bit about the Magi. What about the star itself? Now, it's perfectly possible that God made a star appear supernaturally, and that he supernaturally told the Magi what it meant. But there is another option, that God was slowly and methodically preparing the ground for Jesus' birth, and that he did this in 3 ways. The first is that there is apparently a story in the Zoroastrian scriptures about a star that will appear that will herald the birth of the King of Kings. Zoroastrianism is this religion that believes that everything in the world is this battle between good and evil. Fun trivia fact, they're still around today, there's not very many of them left, but a famous Zoroastrian, in case you want to store this for the next trivia night, is Freddie Mercury from Queen. He was a Zoroastrian. Anyway, in the Zoroastrian scriptures themselves, there is the story of a king of kings who will be born with a star to finally end this battle between good and evil. The second thing that God does is talk to us through the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Daniel tells the story of when the Babylonian tribes came through. They conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. They destroyed the temple. They took the Israelites into exile. And when they did that, they took all the best and brightest young men from Israel and put them into the service of the king. And so Daniel and his friends end up being employed in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel goes on to tell us the story that Nebuchadnezzar had a couple of dreams, and he asked his advisors to interpret the dreams for him. Now, these advisors were the Magi, and the Magi are unable to interpret the dream, but God gives Daniel the wisdom to interpret the dream accurately. And so it turns out within kind of the culture of the Magi, Daniel and the Jewish God gains credibility. And it turns out later in the book of Daniel, he has this vision and this prophecy. In chapter 9, it says, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, and to bring everlasting righteousness. And so 77s is interpreted as 70 times 7, or 490 years. And it turns out that 490 years from Daniel is almost exactly when Jesus was born. And so we have this almost culture and prophecy within the Zoroastrian Magi, if you want, that something big is going to happen in almost 500 years' time. And in fact, 3 independent historians, Tacitus, Josephus, and Suetonius, all working at that time, tell us that there was indeed this kind of anticipation all across the Middle East that something big was going to happen, that a king was going to be born that was going to make a big difference in the world. I don't know if it's like those of you who are old enough to remember the Y2K, this sense that maybe something was going to happen, something big. I don't know if it was like that, but the sense is something big was going to happen. And then the third thing is the star itself. So it turns out that right at the time of Jesus' birth, there was this conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. Now, that meant nothing to me, but an astronomer in the Royal Observatory in the UK has done some historical digging, and it turns out that the way they interpreted the stars, this is what it would have meant. So Jupiter was the star of power and royalty. Saturn was the star of Palestine, and Pisces was the constellation that was the sign of the last days. So when you have this conjunction, this overlap between Jupiter and Saturn, it would have appeared as one big star. The interpretation would have been that the ruler of the last days will appear in Palestine. And so it's quite likely that God was methodically and slowly preparing the ground for these guys to understand what was happening. And he was telling them the story of Jesus' birth in the stars. Now, we saw that they were likely in the employ of the king, and so it turns out that the Parthian king at the time was King Phraates IV. And so politically, you would think if the king of the end of the age, and who's going to put an end to the battle between good and evil, is going to be born, you want to be on good terms with them, don't you? So likely he would have sent an official state delegation to the current king of Palestine to set friendly terms and to tell them how well-disposed he was to them. Now, it turns out at that time, the official state delegations would have consisted of many people and many gifts. There would have been a whole entourage. We normally think of 3 because there's 3 gifts, but nowhere in the Bible does it tell us that. And in fact, in the Orthodox Church, depending on which branch, they believe there's perhaps 12 or 24 wise men who were there. Anyway, the history tells us that there was likely a very large entourage that went over. And the thing is that it would have taken many weeks first of all, to get that whole entourage together, and to prepare gifts, because normally when you went to a neighboring king, you would bring what is most valuable from your own place. And so gold, well, gold's always been valuable. As DJ said, frankincense and myrrh were the resin from very rare trees that grew only in the Arabian Peninsula. Frankincense was the best kind of incense to make offerings with, and myrrh was used in both making perfume and in medicines. And so this was probably representing all the most expensive and the best that Parthia had to offer to Palestine. Now, the early church theologians have read some symbolism into this, that king is obviously Jesus's royalty, that frankincense, being what you use to offer sacrifices to gods, represents Jesus's divinity, and that myrrh, being the perfume that is used in burial spices, represents Jesus's humanity and his death. Now, whether the Magi knew this and were thinking about the symbolism when they took it, the story is kind of silent about that. But anyway, there it is. Either way, they were gifts fit for a king. Now, it says that when they... And now, the other thing is that by the time you gather an entourage like this and get these gifts together and make your way to Jerusalem from Parthia, the thought is it might have taken many months, probably around a year, by the time you get all this together, from the time that they saw the star to the time that they actually meet Herod. And keep that in mind because it'll come in at the rest of the story. Now, when they finally meet Herod, it says that Herod was disturbed and all Jerusalem with him. Now, that's an understatement. It probably means all hell broke loose in Herod's court. Because the history, and to give you the picture, is that in 41 BC, Herod and his brother were appointed tetrarchs, or rulers of that area of Palestine. But less than a year later, the Parthians, yes, the same Parthians that sent the three wise men, actually attacked Rome, won that battle, and installed their own king, Antigonus, on the throne of Palestine. In that process, they killed Herod's brother, and Herod had to flee. So Herod spends the next 3 years working the back rooms of power and politics, gets the Roman Empire to back him. In 37 BC, he attacks the Parthians again, takes back his throne, and is there until Jesus is born. But this guy is absolutely paranoid. Let me read to you his record over the 30-plus years that he's in power. He kills all the previous rulers of Palestine and all their supporters. He kills half the Sanhedrin. He kills 300 of his own court officers. He kills his favorite wife. He kills his brother-in-law, his mother-in-law, and near the end of his life, he kills his own 3 sons because he thought they would steal the throne from him. So this is a fellow who is absolutely paranoid and ruthless. And so you can imagine when these 3 wise men from Parthia, his old enemy, come and they say, we're looking for the king of the Jews, they obviously don't recognize him as king of the Jews. He's thinking this is some kind of nefarious plot to overthrow me. And you can imagine when it says all Jerusalem was disturbed, it was chaos. And so he seems to hold his stuff together and plays it cool and asks his scribes and Pharisees, where is the king to be born? Where's the Messiah supposed to be born? And they say, Bethlehem. Now, it turns out Bethlehem is only 8 kilometers from Jerusalem, so it's less than a day's journey, basically. But at this point, the star reappears. So we saw the star was a conjunction, perhaps, of Venus and Saturn. That would have happened for one night, and that was the signal to them to go to Palestine. But then they talk about it in the past, so it disappeared again. But now, after the scribes say to them that the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem, the star reappears and seems to behave supernaturally. It says that the star they had seen went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And this is not normal behavior for a child, for a star, I mean. So something supernatural is happening here. And I think that is doing something in their heart. Because it goes on to say, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Now, it doesn't say that they were joyful the first time they saw the star. It only says they were joyful the second time. And the English is a complete understatement. In the Greek, it says they rejoiced with a joy that was exceedingly great. It is a form of words that is not used anywhere else in the New Testament. And so it's telling us, pay attention here. There is a special kind of joy happening. And in response to that joy, they fall down and worship Jesus. Now, I think what is happening here is that the first time they saw the star, they were making a formal state visit on behalf of their king to another king. But that was the external journey. I think what's happening here is the inner journey. Something about that star has moved them in their heart. They feel a joy that is supernatural. And remember, these magi are used to being in the presence of kings. They're used to royalty, they're used to pomp and circumstance, and yet here they are in front of a baby in a working class poor cottage in this village that is nowhere, and they fall down on their faces. They prostrate themselves and they worship Jesus as God. Now that's remarkable for people who are used to seeing kings and pomp and circumstance. And so I think this marks a shift in them where previously it was an external journey, but now this has become an internal journey. So they move from paying respects and paying homage through to worshiping God themselves. Now, of course, God, because of this new connection they have, this new understanding, God speaks to the wise men, tells them not to go back to Herod. Doesn't tell us how long it took for Herod to realize they weren't coming back, but when they don't, he absolutely loses it, and he slaughters all the children in Bethlehem. This is what the church through the ages has called the slaughter of the innocents. And I'm wondering, if it took about a year for them to arrive to Herod, I wouldn't be surprised if Herod said, well, kill all the one-year-olds, and just to be on the safe side, kill plus or minus 1 year from that, just to cover everybody. Like, we've seen how paranoid he is, and it would be well within his character to do something like that. But of course, he doesn't get Jesus because God warns Joseph in a dream to escape to Egypt. And so they set out, probably a journey of many months, to get to probably Alexandria. There was a large community of expatriate Jewish people in Alexandria, and in all likelihood, that's where they went. And they kind of fled as refugees and lived as refugees. They probably would have depended on the kindness of strangers for anywhere between 1 and 3 years, the thought is, until God tells Joseph again that it's safe for them to head back, and they go to Nazareth. So far, so good? You have a sense of the dynamics of the story and the characters that are at play here? So having done that, now we can look at the gospel. How does this story fit in the light of the gospel and the life and message of Jesus? So I think the first thing that comes through is the fulfillment of prophecy. So as I said, this story is only in Matthew's gospel, and Matthew is called the Jewish gospel because Matthew was Jewish himself, and he was writing to fellow Jewish believers and people he was hoping would become Jewish believers. And so he's at pains to show that all of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah are fulfilled. So in the first chapter, he goes through the genealogy of Jesus to prove that Jesus is indeed from the branch of David. And then the second chapter is unusually stocked full of Old Testament references. We don't have time to go through them all, but basically, this is the literary equivalent of Matthew shouting at us, every prophecy you could imagine in the Old Testament is fulfilled in Jesus. If you're interested, you can take a picture of that or talk to me later and work through it, but we won't have time to do that. The second thing is that although Matthew is called the Jewish gospel, he's also called the gospel to the Gentiles because he is at pains, although he's talking to his Jewish compatriots in the faith, he's at pains to show that God is expanding his kingdom to include non-Jewish people. So if you remember, the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, is found only in Matthew. That's how Matthew ends his gospel. And the interesting thing is that the Greek word for nations, ethnos, can be translated both nations and Gentiles or non-Jews. So when Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, he's also saying, go and make disciples of all non-Jews. He's giving a clear message here, Matthew is, the time has come for God's kingdom to extend to all people, not just Jews, but non-Jews, in fact, the rest of the world. And so Matthew is at pains to make this point to his Jewish believers. And we see this in the Magi. If you think about them, they were non-Jewish. They were from Babylon, Persia, that area. They were magicians, and magic was forbidden by the Mosaic law. So in the Jewish mind, the Magi would have been unclean. And the third thing is that having come from Babylon, remember Babylon was the one that took the southern kingdom of Judah, destroyed it, destroyed the temple, and taken the Israelites into exile. So they were the enemy. So on 3 counts, the Magi were as far from God to a Jewish believer as you could get. They were non-Jewish, they were unclean, they were the enemy. And yet, Matthew starts his gospel with them. He's almost shaming his own people into saying, here are these enemies, these unclean Gentiles, who recognize and worship Jesus, and your own high priests, who are just a day's journey away, don't even bother making the trip to see what the star might be about. He's making a point here to his believers that's a pretty sharp. He's meaning to prod them into action. And then the third thing is I think Matthew is making a comment about politics and power. He's the only one of the gospel that situates the birth of Jesus in the reign of Herod. And he's making a political commentary here. He's contrasting the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. On the one hand, Herod behaves like all the earthly empires always do, which is to use their power to kill, steal, and destroy. Herod sets out to kill all the children. And in what form does God choose to come? As a child himself. It's the complete antithesis. Matthew is making a commentary. This is what earthly kingdoms look like, but this is what heavenly kingdoms look like. The other political comment that may not come through to us today is the star itself. It turns out that when Julius Caesar died, a comet appeared in the sky. And so the next Caesar, Caesar Augustus, took that comet as a sign that Julius Caesar had been deified. He'd become a god. And so the current Caesar was now a son of God. And so Matthew is again making this very political comment. The Roman Empire tells you about a star and a son of God, but let me tell you about the real star and the real son of God. He's making this contrast between the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. Is that making sense? And I think it's this third point that I think we can work with in terms of the application today. Because I think what strikes me is that we live in a similar world full of war and conflict. I mean, in high school, you might learn about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, but the reality is that Rome was constantly in conflict. So when Mary and Jesus and Joseph turned on the evening news, they would have heard about battles against the Germans in the north, against the Spaniards to the northeast, against the Arabian people in the south. There were wars and battle everywhere. Jesus grows up in a brutal regime, in a world full of violence, where adults and children are killed. Much like when we turn on our evening news today, we see the kind of brutal violence in Ukraine, in the Middle East. We see famine in Sudan, in Ethiopia. We don't have to name them all, but it strikes me that we live in a very similar world. And so the question we have today is the same question that they would have had back then. Where is God in all this? And you could imagine a faithful, observant Jew saying to God, hurry up, it's time to act. We have to raise up an army. We have to overthrow the Romans. We have to establish justice in the world. We have to clean up the temple. We have to reestablish it. And it's the same today. And so what is God's answer to that earnest plea? He sends a helpless baby to a poor family in a nowhere neighborhood, far from the center of power. And when the full force of the empire is directed against it, it makes you think of Star Wars, they have to flee as refugees. Like, what kind of plan is that? You'd think God could come up with a better plan than that. And even then, it's going to take 30 years for that baby to grow up and be able to start a ministry. How does that make any sense at all? And yet it does. And we have 2,000 years of evidence that God's plan did indeed work. Now, these are two of my favorite books. The first is Dominion by Tom Holland. The subtitle is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And the second one is The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi. He's a theologian and a philosopher. And the subtitle is How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. And both of these books are incredibly well researched, incredibly articulated, but basically they both make the point that it doesn't matter what area of human endeavor you look at, whether it's the arts, sciences, law, medicine, education, everything that we think of as progress in Western civilization, everything that we are most proud of in terms of Western civilization, all has its roots in the gospel. And so if anybody ever asks you, what has the church ever done for the world, direct them to these two books. They are highly well articulated and researched, and it has shaped us to such a degree that we don't even realize it. It's like fish swimming in water. They don't even realize the water is there. We don't realize the extent to which the gospel and God's plan has shaped everything around us. And so when we ask, where is God today? He is there today the same that he was back then. He's with the refugee, the poor, the unnoticed, the powerless, the downtrodden, the helpless. God meets us in the midst of this mess. And so I think when I reflected on all this, I thought there were 5 applications. So drawing to a close, if the worship team wants to come up. I think the first application that comes is don't be seduced by the world's power. I think what we see today in politics is that both the left and the right of politics are competing to gain earthly power. They want to get into government so that they can use earthly power to push their agenda, whether it's left or right. Now, Jesus could have come and used power. He could have come as a politician, he could have come as emperor, could have come as a general, and yet he doesn't. He came as a helpless baby child to a poor family. That says something about how he wants to use power, how God uses power. And so if we want to spread Jesus' message, I think we have to use Jesus' methods as well. That's not to say we don't get involved in politics, but that's not the primary means by which Jesus means the gospel to be spread. I think the second application is not to get cynical or disheartened. I think when we look at the evening news and we see this world that is full of violence and brutality, it's easy to say, maybe we should all just destroy it and start again. And yet God promised after the flood with Noah that he would never again destroy the world. And in this brutal, conflict-filled world of the Roman Empire, Jesus sends his son to redeem it, not to judge it or destroy it, but to redeem it. And so if God doesn't get cynical about our world, neither should we. Third is I think we can sometimes let that cynicism and disheartenment spill over into the church. There's probably none of us who have not been disappointed or hurt by the church in one form or another. And yet, baby Jesus grew up and gave his life to invest in 12 people who then gave their lives to invest in more people who went on to do the same, and slowly God has built his church. And the church is plan A, and God does not have a plan B. So we need to resist this temptation to become cynical about the church. It is God's chosen instrument, regardless of how imperfect it is. The fourth application is to remember that we have God's power. And so I don't know about you, but sometimes when I watch the evening news, and I have to admit I'm a news junkie, you look at the images of Ukraine, you look at the images of the Middle East, you look at the images of Sudan, and you feel powerless. And you think, what difference can I make to make a difference over there? It seems so far away. And yet, Paul reminds us that we have God's power. He says in Ephesians 1:19, let me read it to you. He says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his people, and this is the part, his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead. Paul is saying something revolutionary here. He's saying the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is at work in us as believers. And so even though we might be tempted to feel powerless when we watch the evening news, we have power through the Spirit of God. We have power in our words, we have power in our actions, we have powers in our prayers, we have power in our character. And to the extent that we cooperate with God where he's placed us, we are helping build the kingdom. And one way or another, that kingdom is going to win. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Columbo TV series. You remember? The thing that was different about Columbo is that you started knowing the mystery. And the whole thing was watching Columbo unravel it and come to the conclusion that you had been told at the very beginning. We're in a bit the same position. We know how it's going to end. We know who the winner is. But we just have to go through that process. God is working through us and through his church. And the last one is be like the Magi. And what I mean by that is recognize where God is working. You know, I've already said when Joseph and Mary and Jesus watched the evening news, the focus would have been over here, on the Roman Empire, on Caesar, on Herod, on Jerusalem, on the temple. And God was at work all the time here. Not in the limelight, but hidden in plain sight over here. And the Magi recognized that. Although they were in this world, they were used to princes and powers and kings, they recognized that God was not at work here, he was at work here. Right? And so I think the challenge for us is to recognize where is God at work today. It's not going to be in the limelight, but it's going to be hidden in plain sight. And if we can figure out what God is doing and what he's asking us, our role to be in helping build that kingdom, we can be like the Magi. And so that's the story of Christmas, that the birth of a helpless baby made all the difference back then, and it still makes all the difference today.